It was a frozen morning on the Western Front, the kind where even the wind seemed to have given up hope. Snow mixed with mud, the air thick with gunpowder and silence. And somewhere between two worlds divided by trenches and barbed wire, a single British sniper raised his scope. His finger hovered over the trigger, steady, trained, ready. But in that moment, something happened that defied everything he'd been taught. He didn't fire. This is the untold story of a man who, in the middle of the bloodiest war in history, made a choice that went against instinct, against duty, and perhaps against survival itself. A story that began not with a bullet, but with a moment of mercy, one that would echo years later, when fate gave him the chance to return the gesture to the very same man who'd once spared his life. To understand this story, we have to go back to the trenches of World War I. It was 1916, and Europe had turned into a machine that ate men alive. The Battle of the Somme had already claimed over 1 million lives, and soldiers lived like ghosts in mud-filled ditches, their souls as damp as their boots. For many of them, life was measured not in days, but in heartbeats between shells. Among those soldiers was a young British marksman named Thomas Calder. He wasn't the kind of man who dreamed of glory or medals. Before the war, he'd been a farmhand from Yorkshire, quiet, steady, the kind who could hit a tin can from 100 yards without blinking. When the war broke out, his skill with a rifle made him an ideal candidate for sniper duty. Snipers were different from regular soldiers. They didn't charge across no man's land or shout commands. They waited, hidden in shadows, camouflaged in mud and brush. They lived for the one shot that could change the course of a battle. But it wasn't an easy life. Isolation, nerves, and the constant knowledge that someone on the other side was also looking for you. For Thomas, it began as duty. But soon, the job started to weigh on him. Every pull of the trigger felt less like victory and more like a burden. The faces he saw through his scope began to haunt him, not as enemies, but as men. One morning in early 1917, Thomas was assigned to a ridge overlooking a German trench network near Arras. The mist was so thick it looked like the earth itself was exhaling. He crawled into position with his spotter, Private Ellis, and they began their watch. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. Then Thomas saw movement. Through his scope, he spotted a German soldier emerging cautiously from a dugout. The man wasn't armed. He looked young, maybe 20, no more, carrying a small metal pot, probably fetching water. Thomas adjusted his scope, the crosshairs settling on the man's chest. It should have been an easy shot, but something stopped him. The soldier turned slightly, and in that fleeting instant, Thomas saw his face clearly, tired, thin, but human. Not a monster, just another man trying to survive this madness. And in that fragile moment of hesitation, the German soldier froze and looked directly toward Thomas's position. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Two men, two enemies, staring across the invisible line of death between them. Then, something unexpected happened. The German raised his hand slightly, almost in acknowledgement, and slowly walked away. Thomas lowered his rifle. Private Ellis, confused, whispered sharply, "Why didn't you take the shot?" Thomas said nothing. He just kept watching the spot where the soldier had disappeared into the fog. In the weeks that followed, that brief encounter stayed with him. He couldn't explain why he hadn't fired. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the growing realization that this war had turned men into targets, stripping away everything else. Months passed. Battles came and went. The war dragged on, and Thomas continued doing his duty, but something in him had changed. He fired less often, and when he did, it was only when absolutely necessary. To his fellow soldiers, he was still marksman. But inside, he was becoming something else, a man trying to hold onto his humanity amid the inhuman. Then came 1918, the year the war began to turn. The German army, though still fierce, was weakening. Rumors spread of an armistice, but until that day arrived, the killing didn't stop. And as fate would have it, Thomas would once again find himself looking through a scope at a familiar face. Only this time, the man on the other end of his rifle wasn't just another enemy. He was the enemy, the same one who'd looked into his eyes across the fog and chosen not to shoot. And now, Thomas Calder had a choice to make. The battlefield was silent except for distant shell fire. Through his scope, Thomas saw the German sniper adjusting his rifle, aiming, not at Thomas, but at a group of British medics tending to the wounded. It would have been an easy kill. Thomas had every reason, every order, every instinct telling him to fire first. But in that moment, under the same cold sky where mercy had once been given, Thomas hesitated. Because he recognized the man, the face, the eyes, the same man who had spared him months before. What happened next would become one of the most haunting and miraculous exchanges of mercy in wartime history. A story few believed and fewer understood. And yet it happened. Thomas Calder's finger rested on the trigger. The crosshairs danced slightly as his breathing slowed. Through the magnified glass, he could see the German's eye pressed against his own scope, a mirror reflection of himself. Both men locked in a silent standoff that stretched beyond war, beyond duty. And then, the memory came flooding back. The fog, the raised hand, that brief, wordless act of mercy months earlier. The man he had spared, or perhaps the man who had spared him. It was him, same sharp jawline, same faint scar across his cheek. The odds were impossible, and yet there he was. Thomas whispered under his breath, "It's him." Private Ellis, who was spotting beside him, didn't understand. "Who?" "The one from Arras," Thomas said quietly, almost to himself. Ellis frowned. "Then you know what to do." But Thomas didn't move. He watched as the German sniper adjusted his aim again, lining up his shot toward the British medics. Thomas could end it now. One squeeze, and he'd save lives. One pull, and the man who had once shown him mercy would be gone forever. But what does a man owe to his own conscience? To the enemy who chose humanity over hatred? As Thomas watched, the German sniper hesitated. For a moment, their scopes crossed, as if both men were aware of each other's presence, though neither could truly see the other. Then, the German did something unexpected. He lowered his rifle. Slowly, deliberately. He looked up from his position and turned his head slightly toward the British line, as if he knew. Thomas felt his throat tighten. The German wasn't going to fire. Maybe he had recognized Thomas's position, or maybe, just like before, he'd chosen mercy. Whatever the reason, he was lowering his weapon instead of using it. Ellis hissed, "What are you doing?" "Take the shot." Thomas whispered, "He's not aiming anymore." "That's not the point, Tom. Orders are orders." But Thomas had already made his decision. He slowly eased his finger off the trigger and lowered his rifle. The war had taken enough from both of them. Maybe this was how he could take something back. A few days later, word spread that a German sniper had been captured alive during a raid. Wounded, but alive. When Thomas heard the name on the prisoner list, his blood froze. Franz Becker, the same face from his scope, the same eyes from the fog. Thomas requested to see him. The officers were skeptical, but after persistent asking, they allowed it. Inside a makeshift field hospital, lit by flickering lanterns, lay the German sniper. A bandage covered his shoulder, his uniform torn and bloodstained. When Thomas entered, the man looked up slowly, and recognition flashed instantly between them. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Franz smiled faintly and said in broken English, "You did not fire." Thomas nodded. "Neither did you." The German chuckled weakly. "Then we are even." It was a surreal moment. Two men from opposing sides, bound not by hatred or politics, but by a shared choice that defied both. They talked quietly for several minutes. About the war, about home, about how strange it was that mercy, something so small, so human, could exist in a world built on destruction. When Franz was transferred to a POW camp in England, Thomas made sure he was treated well. He even sent word through Red Cross channels to ensure that Franz's family in Germany knew he was alive. It was a small gesture, but one that would be remembered. After the war ended in 1918, both men returned to their homes, broken, changed, but alive. Years later, in the early 1930s, Thomas received a letter. It was from Germany. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message wasn't. "Dear Thomas Calder, perhaps you do not remember me, but I never forgot you. I now have a small farm, a wife, and a son. I hope peace will last for our children's sake. Your friend, Franz Becker. Thomas kept that letter for the rest of his life. Now, you might wonder, was this story real? Could two snipers truly meet like this twice across the chaos of World War I? It sounds impossible. Yet, history is filled with such coincidences that border on the miraculous. In fact, there are multiple documented cases during both world wars where soldiers spared each other in moments of compassion. In 1915, a British and a German soldier supposedly exchanged salutes instead of bullets near Ypres. During the 1914 Christmas truce, men from both sides shared cigarettes and sang carols across no man's land. Humanity, it seems, always finds a way to break through the cracks of war. And though Thomas Calder and Franz Becker's story never made it to official records, like so many personal acts of mercy, it circulated among soldiers who'd served on the Western Front. Some said they'd heard the story from Calder himself in the years after the war, when he worked quietly as a postman in Yorkshire. Others said they'd seen the German's name listed among POWs with a British note beside it, mercy repaid. Whether the tale became legend or remained truth hardly mattered. What it revealed was something far deeper, that even in humanity's darkest hour, there were still moments of light. Thomas never bragged about what he did. He never wrote a memoir or told newspapers. When asked about the war, he'd simply say, "I did what I had to do and what I chose not to." By the time the Second World War broke out, Thomas was too old to fight again. He watched from afar as the world once more descended into chaos, wondering if Franz, if he was still alive, had to watch his own son go through the same horror they'd both survived. The story of the sniper who refused to fire became a quiet symbol among veterans, a reminder that not all courage is found in killing. Sometimes it's found in restraint. And as history would soon reveal, fate wasn't quite done with Thomas and Franz. Their paths, against all odds, would cross one final time, in a way neither could have imagined. It was 1944. Europe was once again burning. The world had promised that the Great War would be the one to end all wars, but 25 years later, the guns had returned. This time, the skies were filled with bombers, the cities with sirens, and the ground shook with a fury even worse than before. Thomas Calder was now in his late 40s. He lived quietly in northern England, working at the post office, his uniform replaced by a simple gray coat. Each morning, he sorted letters, many addressed to soldiers at the front. Sometimes he'd pause, his hands trembling slightly as he read the names. Too many reminded him of boys he'd once trained, now fighting a new kind of war he barely understood. Then, one morning, as he sorted through a stack of Red Cross correspondence, his eyes froze on a familiar name. It was faint, typed on a thin envelope from Switzerland, marked Prisoner Exchange Records. The name read, Franz Becker. For a long moment, Thomas didn't breathe. He turned the envelope over and saw that it wasn't addressed to him. It was official paperwork meant for local verification. But attached to it, tucked between the pages, was a smaller folded note. Handwritten, personal. He unfolded it slowly. Inside were a few lines written in that same careful, slightly broken English he remembered from the letter years ago. Dear Thomas, if this reaches you, know that I am alive. Captured in Italy, now in British hands. I think of that day often, the fog, the mercy. Perhaps it was meant so we both could live to see this day. I pray this war will end soon. If I do not make it, I want you to know I did not fire again. Not once. Your friend, Franz. Thomas stood frozen in the sorting room, the hum of the telegraph wires above him fading into silence. For years, he had wondered whether Franz had survived the new war. And now, in this fragile letter smuggled through bureaucracy and battlefields, he had his answer. He immediately sent a request through the local British authorities to verify the German POW's location. Weeks passed. Then one rainy afternoon, an official vehicle pulled up outside the post office. A young officer stepped out, soaked to the bone, and handed Thomas a sealed envelope. From a war office, the man said softly, "It concerns the prisoner you inquired about." Thomas tore it open with shaking hands. It read, POW number 11804, Becker, Franz. Captured in Italy, transferred to Camp 186, Yorkshire region. Status, alive. Cooperative. Health stable. Yorkshire, the same county Thomas lived in. He sat down, stunned. After decades, 2 wars, oceans of death, fate had brought Franz Becker not just back into his life, but practically to his doorstep. The next morning, Thomas requested permission to visit the camp under civilian supervision. The guards were reluctant, rules were strict, and visiting German POWs was rare. But when Thomas presented the old correspondence, explaining who Franz was and how their story began in 1917, one officer listened quietly and said, "If half of that's true, sir, I think you've earned a meeting." 2 days later, Thomas walked through the gates of Camp 186. Rows of huts stretched under a gray sky, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Prisoners worked silently in the cold, mending fences, hauling supplies. A guard led him toward a small infirmary near the edge of the camp. Inside, a man sat reading beside a window, pale but alive. When Thomas entered, the man looked up slowly. His face was older now, the lines deeper, but those eyes, those unmistakable eyes, were the same. Franz Becker smiled faintly. "So it is you." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "It's been a long time." Franz rose weakly from his chair and extended a trembling hand. "Too long." The 2 men stood in silence for a moment before shaking hands. Firm, human, defying everything that separated them. Around them, the camp noise faded, replaced by something timeless and still. They spoke for nearly an hour. About their families. About the senselessness of this new war. Franz told Thomas that he'd refused sniper duty when conscription came again, saying he'd fired enough in the last one. He'd been forced into the infantry instead, captured during the Allied advance in Italy. When it was time to leave, Franz said quietly, "You once said mercy comes at a cost. I think you were right, but it's the only thing that lasts." Thomas smiled faintly. "You remembered that?" Franz nodded. "I remembered everything." They met only one more time before the war ended. In 1946, when the POWs were released, Franz returned to Germany. Before he left, he sent one last letter to Thomas, thanking him not only for the past, but for proving that compassion could survive even the cruelest of centuries. Years later, when Thomas died peacefully in his home, his daughter found 2 letters framed side by side on his wall. One dated 1918, the other 1944. Beneath them, a small handwritten note in her father's script read, 2 wars, 2 shots not fired, 2 men who remembered to be human. It became a quiet family legend, passed down through generations. No medals, no headlines, just a story about how mercy can echo across lifetimes. Even historians who try to trace the records found fragments. A German sniper named Becker on POW rosters, a British sniper named Calder listed at Eris. But beyond that, the trail went cold. Perhaps it was real, perhaps embellished. But maybe that's what gives the story its power. It reminds us of what could be true, what should be true. In the chaos of war, amid mud, bullets, and orders shouted through smoke, 2 men saw past the uniforms. They saw each other, and for a brief, impossible moment, the war stopped. As long as that story is remembered, maybe humanity itself still stands a chance. Because sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is not to pull the trigger,